Following the completion of G-Park Zevenaar, one of Europe's largest renewable energy installations, GLP Clean Energy has signed a power purchase agreement with Fastned, the European fast charging company. The agreement got arranged through the leading energy firm Scholt Energy. My name is Stefano Fissolo and I'm the Senior Director of GLP Clean Energy. GLP is the global business builder, developer, owner and operator of logistics real estates, data centers and renewable energies. Within GLP Clean Energy is responsible for developing, owning and operating renewable energy assets. G-Park Zevenaar is a major logistic park in the Netherlands with a build area of 115,000 square meters, making it one of the largest installations of this type in Europe. The solar plant produces approximately 15 million kilowatt-hours per year. That is equivalent to the consumption of 5,000 Dutch households and saving approximately 5,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Over the lifetime, this corresponds to approximately 80,000 tons or planting an equivalent amount of trees of 150,000. Under the terms of this agreement, Fastned will purchase an amount of energy covering a significant part of the consumption of electric vehicle charging installation across the Netherlands, like this one. The power of the rooftop solar project at G-Park Zevenaar is 3 times sustainable. First, because it's coming from the sun. Second, because it does not occupy farmland. And third, because the price is fixed for 8 years, thus protecting Fastned and its customers against the volatility of energy prices. This agreement contributes to a more sustainable future and helps accelerating both the energy and mobility transitions together. For 2024, we have a pipeline of identified seed projects totaling approximately 60 megawatts, so watch the space for more announcements.
I'm Roland. I work as Energy Sourcing Manager at fast charging company Fastned. We own and operate more than 300 stations in Europe, where you can charge your car in just 15 minutes at iconic stations like you see behind me. In the Netherlands, we own and operate more than 165 fast charging stations. In Europe, we are active in 7 countries, with 2 more countries that will be added later this year. We own and operate more than 300 stations, offering more than 1,700 fast charging spots for electric vehicles. It's our mission to provide renewable energy from solar and wind for our customers when they charge their vehicle. GLP offered us the production of the solar roof of the plant in Zevenaar, and we're glad to took the offer to bring that renewable energy to our customers. The agreement that we signed with GLP delivers us 15 gigawatt hours of electricity per year for the next 8 years, and all of this electricity will be used to power the stations and charge the vehicles of our customers. One of the things that this agreement will bring is also more price stability that we can offer to our customers, since we've signed a long-term agreement to purchase power from the GLP roof in Zevenaar.
My name is Michiel van der Steen and I'm Senior Energy Transition Specialist at Scholt Energy. Scholt is the link between producer and off-taker, which means that we take care of the complete handling of the corporate PPA between GLP and Fastned. We take care of the curtailment of the solar park, which means that we can switch off based on balancing and energy markets, so we can help the grid operator and create additional income for both Fastned and GLP.
I'm Mike Dusseldorp, the head of PPA and energy markets within Ecorus. Ecorus is a solar financer, a developer, an EPC party and partly an O&M party. So basically we do the full cycle of solar deployment. We do this in 6 different countries for more than 30 years. And within Ecorus, I'm responsible, along with my team, to help corporate clients like Fastned to reach their sustainability ESG targets by sourcing solar energy from another asset via a corporate PPA. So we could help all parties involved in the contract to consider what's important to think about whenever you enter such a contract. So we guided the process to come to a contract that works for both parties. This is one of the largest rooftop solar systems within the Netherlands, but it is for sure the largest corporate PPA of a rooftop solar project in the Netherlands and the countries around it.